Saipan, July 1944. Emiko Nakamura pressed her body against the wet cave wall, her white nurse uniform now brown with weeks of accumulated filth. The stench of unwashed bodies, fear, and death filled the underground darkness. Outside, American voices echoed through the jungle. The battle was lost. Emiko clutched a cyanide capsule in her trembling hand. She had seen the propaganda films. She knew what American soldiers did to captured Japanese women. Torture, violation, horrors worse than death. Around her, other women chose suicide over capture. Emiko raised the capsule to her lips. Then an explosion collapsed part of the cave entrance. Rocks rained down. Everything went black. When Emiko opened her eyes, she was surrounded by American soldiers. This was it. The nightmare was beginning. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. Pain radiated from her left arm. One of the soldiers was checking her pulse, speaking in English she couldn't understand. His touch was firm but not violent. Not yet, she thought. They're waiting. She closed her eyes and prayed for death to come quickly. Instead, she felt herself being lifted onto a stretcher. They were taking her somewhere, to do unspeakable things. She waited for the terror to begin, but as consciousness faded again, all she felt was the strange gentleness of hands that didn't want to hurt her. It made no sense. Emiko woke in a medical tent. White canvas overhead. The smell of antiseptic instead of rotting flesh. Her arm was bandaged professionally. An IV drip fed into her other arm. She was clean. Someone had washed the dirt from her skin while she was unconscious. Panic seized her chest. They had touched her while she was helpless. This was how it started. A tall American officer appeared beside her cot. Captain William Bradford checked the IV, felt her pulse at her wrist, examined her bandages. His movements were clinical, professional. He smiled at her reassuringly and said something in English before walking away. Emiko lay rigid with confusion. What kind of psychological torture was this? Pretending to be kind before the real horror began. For 3 days, Emiko refused to acknowledge her captors. She kept her eyes closed when they approached. She wouldn't eat or drink. She was waiting for the mask to drop, for the Americans to reveal their true nature. But they kept bringing food, kept changing her bandages, kept monitoring her vital signs with the same care they showed the American soldiers in adjacent cots. On the 4th day, an Asian woman in American uniform sat beside her bed. The woman spoke in halting, broken Japanese. "My name is Lieutenant Sarah Chen. You are safe here. You are in a medical facility. We are treating your injuries. We will not harm you." Emiko wanted to scream that it was a lie, but something in Sarah's exhausted eyes made her hesitate. There was no cruelty there. Only weariness and something that looked like compassion. On the 5th day, everything changed. A group of 17 Japanese women arrived at the medical camp. They had been found hiding in caves just like Emiko. Civilian women. A teacher named Michiko Tanaka. A pregnant teenager named Fumiko Watanabe. Shopkeepers, mothers, daughters. They were filthy beyond description. Months of living underground without proper sanitation had left them covered in grime, lice, and open sores. The smell was overwhelming. American medical staff wearing masks gathered them in a separate area. Through Sarah Chen's translation, Captain Bradford explained that for health reasons, everyone needed to be decontaminated. There would be showers. Clean clothes would be provided. Medical examinations would follow. The Japanese women heard the words and felt their blood turn to ice. Michiko understood what was happening. The propaganda had been right. First, they would be forced to undress, to expose themselves to male soldiers. This was how the violation would begin. She looked at the other women and saw the same terror reflected in their eyes. Fumiko, 7 months pregnant, began to shake uncontrollably. An elderly woman started praying. Another woman reached for something in her pocket, probably a hidden blade or poison. Michiko grabbed her wrist. "No, if we are going to die, let us face it with dignity. Do not give them the satisfaction of our fear." But inside, Michiko's heart was hammering. She had heard stories from Manchuria, from Nanking. She knew what soldiers did to captured women. Now it was their turn. The Americans led them to a building that had been converted into a bathing facility. Steam rose from inside. Female nurses stood waiting with towels and soap, but there were also male soldiers nearby, guarding the perimeter. The women were told to remove their filthy clothing, and leave it in designated bins. Michiko felt her hands trembling as she began to undress. This was it, the moment they had all been dreading. Around her, women were crying silently. Fumiko was hyperventilating, her hands protectively covering her swollen belly. An elderly woman whispered prayers to ancestors. They stood there, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for the American men to enter, waiting for the nightmare to become real. But the men didn't enter. Instead, female nurses approached with professional detachment. They directed the women toward shower stations. Hot water, the first they had felt in months, poured from overhead pipes. Soap was provided. Real soap, not the crude substitutes they had been using. The nurses demonstrated how to lather and rinse. They pointed to areas needing special attention. They checked for lice, treating infestations with medicinal shampoo. They examined open sores and made notes for later treatment. Their touch was clinical, not violating. There was no leering, no crude comments, no violence, just efficient professional decontamination. Michiko stood under the hot water and felt something crack inside her chest. This wasn't violation. This was hygiene. Basic medical protocol. They weren't being tortured. They were being cleaned. The psychological whiplash was almost worse than actual violence would have been. For weeks, these women had prepared themselves mentally for rape and death. They had steeled their minds against the worst imaginable horrors. And instead, they got hot showers and soap, clean towels and fresh clothing, female nurses who treated them with brisk efficiency but no cruelty. As Michiko dried herself with a clean towel for the first time in months, she felt tears streaming down her face. Not from pain, from the devastating realization that everything she had been told was a lie. The Americans weren't demons. They were people following medical protocols, preventing disease outbreaks, treating prisoners according to international law. The propaganda had been completely, utterly wrong. Fumiko couldn't stop shaking even after the shower ended. She had been certain that being forced to undress meant she would be violated, that her unborn baby would be killed, that this was the end. Instead, she was handed clean clothes, maternity clothes, sized for her pregnant body. Someone had actually thought about her specific needs. A nurse gently guided her to a medical examination area where Captain Bradford waited with Sarah Chen translating. He explained that he needed to check on the baby's health, that malnutrition and stress could cause complications. He asked permission before each part of the examination. He was gentle, professional, focused entirely on medical assessment. When he finished, he said through Sarah that the baby seemed healthy, but Fumiko needed rest, vitamins, and better nutrition. He prescribed extra rations. He scheduled follow-up examinations. He treated her pregnancy as something valuable, something worth protecting. Fumiko started crying and couldn't stop. Emiko watched the newly arrived women go through the same psychological journey she was experiencing. The terror, the expectation of horror, the shocking reality of basic human decency. That night, as the women huddled together in their assigned tent, they talked in whispers. What did it mean? Was this a trick? A way to lower their guard before the real torture began? Or was it possible that the propaganda had lied about everything? Michiko, as the eldest and most educated, tried to make sense of it. I think, she said slowly, we have been told lies our entire lives. I think the government knew that if we believed Americans were human, we might surrender instead of fighting to the death. So they made us believe Americans were monsters. But these people, she gestured toward the medical tent, they are not monsters. They are exhausted, overworked medical staff following their protocols. Nothing more, nothing less. But not all the American soldiers were happy about the humane treatment. Corporal Mike Henderson had lost his brother at Guadalcanal. He had seen the brutality of Japanese forces firsthand, the torture of captured Marines, the refusal to take prisoners, the suicide charges designed to kill as many Americans as possible. When he saw Captain Bradford treating Japanese women prisoners with the same care as American wounded, something inside him snapped. He confronted Bradford outside the medical tent. With all due respect, sir, why are we wasting resources on them? They're the enemy. My brother died screaming in a Japanese POW camp. These people would have let him rot without a second thought. Why do they deserve our mercy? Bradford understood the anger. He had felt it himself. But anger couldn't guide medical decisions. Corporal, I'm sorry about your brother. Truly. I've seen what Japanese forces do to prisoners. I've treated American soldiers who barely survived captivity. I know the brutality. But I'm a doctor. My oath doesn't distinguish between American blood and Japanese blood. If I start deciding who deserves care based on nationality or what their government did, I've violated everything medicine stands for. These women aren't soldiers. They're civilians and medical personnel. And even if they were combatants, the Geneva Convention is clear. We treat prisoners humanely, not because they deserve it, but because we're Americans, because we're supposed to be better than our worst enemies. Because if we abandon our principles in war, we've already lost the things worth fighting for. Henderson walked away angry, but 3 days later he came back. He had been thinking about Bradford's words. He still didn't agree. The rage over his brother's death was too fresh, too raw, but he had stopped openly complaining. He had even, once, helped carry supplies to the women's tent when asked. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was the first small step toward recognizing that these individual women weren't responsible for his brother's death. That collective guilt was its own form of injustice. Bradford noticed the change and said nothing. Sometimes growth happened slowly, silently. Pushing too hard would only create resistance. Sarah Chen became the vital bridge between two worlds. Her Japanese was imperfect, learned from her grandmother who had fled Manchuria. But it was enough for basic communication, enough to translate medical terminology, enough to ease fears and explain procedures. The work was emotionally exhausting for Sarah. Her own history with Japan was traumatic and painful. Her father had been killed by Japanese soldiers during the invasion of Manchuria. Her younger brother had starved during the occupation. Her mother had died hating the people who destroyed their family. Sarah had inherited that hatred, had carried it like a burning coal in her chest for years. Joining the U.S. military had felt like justice, like fighting back against the people who had taken everything from her. But now she was holding the hands of Japanese women as they cried for their families. She was translating their fears to American doctors who actually cared. She was helping deliver medical care to people who spoke the language of her family's killers. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. One night, Michiko approached her hesitantly. Through broken English, Michiko asked, "Why you help us? Your family. Japan hurt them. I can see in your eyes. You have lost people." Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw with emotion. "Yes, Japan destroyed my family. I have every reason to hate you, to want you to suffer. But I learned something. Hate is a poison that destroys the person carrying it more than anyone else. My mother died from hatred. It ate her alive. I decided I wouldn't let that happen to me. You didn't kill my father. You didn't invade my homeland. You're victims of the same war machine that destroyed my family. Helping you doesn't dishonor his memory. It honors the values he taught me, that all life has worth." Emiko's recovery progressed steadily. As her strength returned, so did her ability to observe and process. She watched the American medical staff work 18-hour shifts with limited resources. She saw them treat Japanese prisoners with the same urgency they treated their own wounded. She witnessed Captain Bradford argue furiously with a supply officer, demanding more morphine for the prisoner ward. His face was red with anger, his voice sharp, not because he enjoyed conflict, but because he genuinely cared about his patients' suffering. All of his patients, regardless of what uniform they had worn or what language they spoke. That night, lying in her cot, Emiko cried for the first time since her capture. Not from physical pain, from shame. She had believed the propaganda so completely, had been ready to die rather than face capture, had thought Americans were incapable of basic human decency. Every assumption had been wrong. The psychological transformation wasn't easy or linear. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, times when old fears resurfaced. One night, a drunken American soldier wandered near the women's tent, shouting angrily about Japanese atrocities. The women inside panicked, certain their fragile safety was about to shatter. But within seconds, American guards intervened. The drunk soldier was removed. An officer came to apologize through Sarah Chen. He assured them that proper discipline would be enforced, that their safety was taken seriously. The women realized that the protection they were receiving wasn't accidental. It was policy. Deliberate, enforced policy. The American military command had decided that prisoners would be treated humanely, and they were following through. That realization was almost as shocking as the shower incident. By August, Emiko felt strong enough to help in the medical tent. At first, the American staff was hesitant. Could they trust a former enemy? But Bradford saw the practical value immediately. Emiko could communicate with Japanese patients in ways he never could. She could explain procedures, calm fears, provide cultural context. She could be a bridge. Bradford approached her one morning with a request. "We have more Japanese wounded arriving. Men this time. Soldiers. They're terrified and in pain. I can treat their injuries, but I can't reach them psychologically. They think we're torturing them when we're trying to help. Would you be willing to assist, to translate and explain?" Emiko felt her heart racing. Japanese soldiers. Men who might have fought alongside people she knew. Men who would see her cooperation as betrayal. But she nodded. "If it saves lives, I will help." Working with Japanese soldier prisoners was harder than Emiko anticipated. Some of them were openly hostile to her, calling her a traitor for helping Americans. Others were simply broken, physically and psychologically devastated by injury and capture. But Emiko persisted. She explained that Captain Bradford was a skilled surgeon, that American medical care followed international protocols, that resistance would only increase their suffering. Slowly, some of the soldiers began to accept treatment, to allow American doctors to set their broken bones, treat their infections, save their lives. One young soldier, no more than 19, whispered to Emiko after Bradford removed shrapnel from his chest. "I thought they would kill me. I wanted them to kill me. But instead, he saved my life. I don't understand." Emiko met his eyes steadily. "Neither did I. But I'm learning that people are more complicated than propaganda suggests." The turning point for the entire camp came in September. Fumiko went into premature labor at 32 weeks. It was the middle of the night when her water broke. The other women panicked, certain that both mother and baby would die. Michiko ran for help, her heart pounding. Within minutes, the entire medical operation mobilized. Captain Bradford appeared in surgical clothes. 2 experienced nurses prepared the small delivery area. Sarah Chen took her position at Fumiko's head, ready to translate and provide emotional support. Bradford worked with absolute focus. The labor was difficult and dangerous. Fumiko was weak from months of inadequate nutrition. The baby was premature and small. Complications arose repeatedly, but Bradford refused to give up. 7 hours later, a baby's cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness. A girl, tiny but alive, breathing on her own. Bradford wrapped the infant carefully in clean blankets and placed her in Fumiko's arms. The young mother looked down at her daughter with a mixture of wonder, exhaustion, and overwhelming love. Bradford's eyes were wet with tears he didn't try to hide. Sarah Chen was openly crying. The nurses who had assisted were smiling despite their exhaustion. In that moment, nationality ceased to matter. They were all just humans who had fought together to bring new life into a world consumed by death. Fumiko looked up at Bradford and said in halting English, "Thank you. You save us. Both." Bradford squeezed her shoulder gently. "That's what doctors do. We bring life. Always." The baby's birth changed everything. Fumiko named her daughter Hana, meaning flower, a symbol of beauty and hope in the midst of devastation. The other Japanese women rallied around mother and child, helping with care and support, but so did the American staff. Lieutenant Sarah Chen knitted a small blanket during her rare off-duty hours. A Marine corporal carved a wooden rattle from scrap wood, bashfully presenting it to Fumiko through Sarah. Nurses took turns checking on Hana, monitoring her weight and development with meticulous care. Captain Bradford examined her daily, tracking every ounce gained, every milestone reached. The tiny premature infant became a shared project, a symbol of something good surviving in the midst of hell. Even Corporal Henderson, who had been so angry about resources spent on Japanese prisoners, was affected. He came to the medical tent one afternoon with a small stuffed toy he had received in a care package from home. Through Sarah, he told Fumiko that his own daughter was about Hana's age, that he missed her terribly, that he wanted Hana to have the toy. Fumiko accepted it with tears streaming down her face. Henderson walked away quickly, not trusting himself to speak. Later, Bradford found him sitting alone, staring at a photo of his own family. The war had taught Henderson to hate, but a tiny Japanese baby was teaching him to remember his humanity. It was a painful, confusing lesson, but necessary. News from the outside world continued to filter into the camp. Japan was losing badly. American forces advanced island by island toward the Japanese homeland. There were reports of massive bombing campaigns. Cities reduced to rubble. The Japanese women worried constantly about their families. Were their parents alive? Their siblings? Their children? Michiko wrote letters to her family that she knew would never be delivered. It helped somehow to put her feelings on paper, to tell them she was alive and being treated well. That last part felt surreal to write. Being treated well by the enemy. Who could have imagined such a thing? Yet it was true. The Americans had kept every promise. They had provided medical care, food, shelter, safety. They had not harmed her. They had treated her with basic human dignity. That simple fact challenged everything she had been taught about the war. By October 1944, the camp had developed its own routines. Morning medical rounds, afternoon rest periods, evening meals eaten communally. The Japanese women still wanted desperately to go home. They prayed for the war to end so they could search for their families. But their daily existence had become almost normal. Emiko assisted in surgeries. Michiko helped with translation and cultural mediation. Fumiko cared for Hana while other women watched and offered advice. They had formed something resembling a community. Not quite friendship, the power imbalance prevented true equality, but mutual respect, shared humanity, recognition that they were all trapped in impossible circumstances beyond their control. One afternoon, a critically wounded American soldier was brought in from a firefight. He was barely 20 years old, bleeding heavily from multiple shrapnel wounds. Bradford worked frantically to save him, but he needed more hands immediately. Without hesitation, Emiko stepped forward. She followed Bradford's rapid-fire commands with practiced efficiency, clamping vessels, monitoring vitals, adjusting equipment. The surgery lasted nearly 5 hours. The soldier survived. Afterward, Bradford looked at Emiko with profound respect and exhaustion. "You just saved an American life," he said quietly. "An enemy soldier who might have been shooting at your countrymen yesterday." Emiko met his eyes steadily. "I saved a person, a boy who was calling for his mother, just like you saved me. That's what healers do. We save lives. Politics doesn't enter the operating room." Winter brought new challenges. A flu outbreak hit the camp hard, affecting both American and Japanese patients. The medical staff worked around the clock trying to prevent fatalities. Bradford himself caught the virus but refused to stop working until Sarah Chen physically forced him to rest. "You're no good to anyone dead," she told him bluntly. "Lie down before you collapse and become another patient we have to treat." For 3 days, Bradford was confined to a cot, feverish and frustrated. His staff managed without him, proving their competence. When he recovered, he felt humbled and grateful for the Japanese women who had helped nurse sick Americans back to health. Emiko had worked tirelessly during the outbreak. Michiko had helped coordinate care. They had given far more than duty required. They had given genuine compassion. December brought a delegation from the International Red Cross. They interviewed prisoners privately, inspected facilities, and documented treatment protocols. The Japanese women told the truth. They were being treated according to Geneva Convention standards. They received adequate medical care, food, and protection. The initial shower incident, which had terrified them, was explained as standard decontamination protocol. The Red Cross representatives seemed surprised by the level of care. Reports from other theaters painted very different pictures. Japanese treatment of Allied POWs was notoriously brutal. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Captain Bradford knew his camp's operations were being documented as evidence of American adherence to international law. He felt uncomfortable with the political implications but couldn't deny the truth. They did provide humane treatment. If that served propaganda purposes, so be it. What mattered was that his patients received proper care. Christmas 1944 was bittersweet. The American staff decorated the medical tents with paper chains and a small pine tree. On Christmas Eve, carols were sung. The Japanese women didn't know the words, but hummed along. Fumiko held 9-month-old Hana, who had grown into a healthy, smiling baby against all odds. Captain Bradford approached them that evening. "Through Sarah," he said, "I hope next year you're home with your family." In a Japan at peace. Fumiko nodded, tears streaming down her face. I hope you are home with your family too, Captain. You have been kind when you didn't have to be. I will never forget. Bradford felt his throat tighten with emotion. May we all find peace, he said softly. May this war end soon. The new year brought devastating news. American B-29 bombers had intensified their campaign against Japanese cities. Tokyo was firebombed in March 1945. The destruction was apocalyptic. Tens of thousands of civilians died in a single night. The Japanese women were inconsolable. Michiko's family lived in Tokyo. She didn't know if they had survived. The uncertainty was torture. She collapsed in Sarah Chen's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Sarah held her, offering no empty comfort. There were no words. The war was a machine devouring everyone indiscriminately. Later that night, Sarah shared her own losses with the group. Her father killed in Manchuria. Her grandmother dead from starvation. Her mother consumed by grief and hatred. We've all lost people to this war, Sarah said quietly. We're all carrying unbearable grief, but we're still here, still breathing, still capable of showing kindness to each other. That has to count for something. In April, Germany surrendered. The European war was over. The Pacific Theater would be next. The Japanese women felt the weight of impending defeat. It was a complicated emotion. Relief that the killing might stop. Grief over national humiliation. Shame at surrender. Fear of what occupation would mean. Captain Bradford tried to prepare them gently. When the war ends, you'll be repatriated to Japan. You'll go home. But Japan will be very different. Occupied. Rebuilding. Resources will be scarce. It will be hard. But you're survivors. You've already endured the unthinkable. You'll manage. Fumiko looked at Hana, now 14 months old and walking. What kind of Japan would her daughter grow up in? A defeated nation under foreign control. Would there be a future for them? Bradford saw her despair. Children adapt, he said gently. They're resilient. Your daughter will grow up knowing her mother survived impossible circumstances with dignity. That's a powerful legacy. On August 6, 1945, the world changed forever. An atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima in seconds. 3 days later, Nagasaki was annihilated. The scale of destruction was incomprehensible. Entire cities erased. Hundreds of thousands dead instantly or dying slowly from radiation. When the Japanese women heard the news, they couldn't process it. Michiko's sister had lived in Hiroshima. Fumiko had cousins there. The grief was all-consuming, and underneath the grief was terror. If America could do this, what else were they capable of? Bradford called a meeting. Through Sarah, he addressed them directly. What happened to those cities is a tragedy I cannot explain or defend. I'm a doctor. I save lives. I don't understand decisions that take them on such massive scale. But I want you to know that how we've treated you here, that's also America. Both things are true. We're capable of terrible destruction and genuine compassion. You've seen our compassion. Hold on to that truth. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. In the medical camp, the Japanese women sat in stunned silence. Years of fighting. Millions dead. And now, defeat. Some cried from relief. Some from shame. Some simply sat numb. The American staff gave them space to grieve. There were no celebrations in front of the prisoners. No gloating. Bradford understood this moment was both liberation and devastation for the Japanese women. Everything they had believed about Japan's divine mission was shattered. But they had survived. And survival mattered. In the following days, preparations began for repatriation. The women would return to their devastated homeland. The prospect terrified them, but they needed to go, needed to find their families, needed to rebuild. The night before departure, Captain Bradford organized a farewell gathering. It was emotional and awkward. The American staff had grown genuinely attached to these women. Fumiko approached Bradford with Hana in her arms. Through Sarah, she said, "You delivered my daughter when we both should have died. You gave us life. I thought Americans were demons. Instead, I found angels." Bradford's eyes filled with tears. "You're a strong woman and a good mother," he said. "Hana is lucky to have you." Michiko gave Sarah Chen a small origami crane. May you find the peace your father would have wanted for you, Michiko said. Sarah clutched the paper crane like treasure. May we all find peace, she whispered. Emiko was the last to say goodbye. She stood before Captain Bradford and Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the two people who had fundamentally transformed her understanding of humanity. In careful English, she said, "When I was forced to undress for the showers, I was certain my worst nightmare was beginning. I prepared myself to be violated. Instead, I received hot water and soap. That moment changed everything. You showed me that propaganda lies, that enemies can be decent, that humanity survives even in war. I will carry this lesson forever." Bradford embraced her briefly. "You became an excellent nurse, and an even better person," he said. "Never let the war take that from you." Emiko promised she wouldn't. The next morning, trucks arrived. The Japanese women boarded for the journey to the port and then home. As the trucks pulled away, Captain Bradford and his staff stood at attention, saluting. Not a military salute, but something more personal. A gesture of mutual respect, of shared survival, of hope that lessons learned in this small camp might ripple outward. Sarah Chen watched until the trucks disappeared. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she asked. Bradford thought carefully. "They're survivors. They've already endured the unimaginable. They'll face hard times in occupied Japan. But they know something most people don't. They know that humanity can survive hatred, that former enemies can show each other mercy. That knowledge will sustain them. It has to." Emiko Nakamura returned to a Japan she barely recognized. Her hometown was destroyed. Everyone she had known was dead or scattered. She spent months searching, finding no one. But she didn't give up. She returned to school, completed her nursing degree, and dedicated her life to healing. For 50 years, she trained hundreds of young nurses. And she told every single one the same story. "During the war, I expected demons and found healers. An American doctor treated me with dignity when he could have treated me with cruelty. He taught me that medicine recognizes no nationality. Remember that always." Michiko Tanaka found her parents alive but traumatized in a Tokyo refugee shelter. Her sister had died in Hiroshima. The grief nearly destroyed her, but she channeled it into purpose. She reopened her school in ruins. She taught children who had lost everything. She taught Japanese and English, but also how to see former enemies as potential allies. She never forgot the Americans who had treated her humanely when they could have been cruel. That example guided her teaching for 40 years. Fumiko Watanabe learned her husband had died in the Philippines in 1944. The confirmation was devastating, even though she had suspected for years. She grieved alone in a Japan that had no resources for individual grief. But she had Hana. Her daughter became everything. Fumiko worked multiple jobs to survive. She made sure Hana received education, and she told her daughter about the American doctor who saved both their lives. About the moment of terror in the showers that became just hot water and soap. About choosing to trust when trust seemed impossible. Hana grew up understanding that people are more complicated than propaganda suggests. Captain William Bradford returned to Iowa in late 1945. He tried to resume his practice but was changed. The war had shown him both the worst and best of humanity. He had nightmares about patients he couldn't save. But he also had moments of profound hope when he thought about the Japanese women, about baby Hana, about Emiko choosing to help save American lives. In 1950, Bradford joined an international medical relief organization. He spent 25 years providing care in war zones and disaster areas. He treated every patient with sacred dignity because each life mattered. Every single one. Lieutenant Sarah Chen struggled after the war with what would later be called PTSD. She coped by helping others. She worked with Japanese American families who had been interned and lost everything. She taught English classes. She volunteered endlessly. Slowly, through helping others heal, she began healing herself. The Japanese women in the medical camp had taught her that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing not to carry hatred forward. That lesson saved her life. In 1975, Emiko Nakamura attended a nursing conference in San Francisco. In the hotel lobby, she saw a familiar face. Captain William Bradford, now 63, was attending the same conference. They stared at each other across 30 years. Then they were embracing, both crying, both laughing. They talked for hours. Before parting, Emiko said something Bradford treasured forever. That moment in the showers when I realized you weren't going to hurt me, that changed my entire life. You proved that even in darkness, light survives. Thank you. The story of the Saipan medical camp deserves to be known. The Japanese women expected their worst nightmares. They had been told Americans were demons. When forced to undress for decontamination showers, they were certain the propaganda's darkest predictions were coming true. They prepared themselves mentally for violation and death. Instead, they received hot water, soap, and clean clothes. That moment of cognitive dissonance shattered their assumptions. If the Americans weren't demons about this, what else had been lies? That question led to transformation, to recognition of shared humanity, to understanding that enemies are often just people on the other side of conflict. The choice to treat prisoners humanely wasn't easy or popular. It required resources during scarcity. It required compassion when hatred would have been easier. But Captain Bradford and his staff chose mercy. They followed international law even when it was inconvenient. They proved that American values meant something real, that democracy and human rights weren't just propaganda, but principles worth maintaining even at personal cost. Those choices rippled outward. They changed lives. They shifted perspectives. They planted seeds of post-war reconciliation. Today, Japan and America are close allies. That friendship was built by millions of individual choices. People like Captain Bradford choosing mercy over vengeance. People like Emiko Nakamura choosing trust despite terror. People like Sarah Chen choosing forgiveness over inherited hatred. People like Michiko Tanaka choosing to teach understanding instead of perpetuating resentment. Every person who refused to let war destroy their humanity contributed to a better future. Their names aren't famous, but their choices mattered. Every single one. War brings out humanity's worst, but it can also reveal our best. The capacity to maintain principles under impossible circumstances. The will to treat enemies as human beings deserving of dignity. The choice to heal even when destroying would be easier. The Saipan medical camp proved that even in hell, compassion is possible, mercy is possible, humanity is possible. The women who entered that camp expecting demons found healers instead. That discovery changed everything, not just for them, but for everyone they touched afterward. The ripples continue even now, decades later, in the students they taught and the lives they shaped. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold historical narratives. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on maintaining humanity during inhumane times. And hit that like button to support content exploring history's complexity. Thank you for watching.